Hey everybody, the next project on my 1966 Lincoln Continental is to continue removing things from under the hood or in the engine bay. And today's project is going to be removing the wiring harness, specifically the engine harness. And I believe there might be two other harnesses underneath the hood, including the harness for the horn, as well as the harness for the headlight assembly. So I am going to start in the front of the car with the horn and the headlights, work my way back to the firewall where the engine harness goes into the cab of the car and everything else in between. So let's get started on that part of the project now. All right, after reviewing what was necessary to remove the engine harness, I quickly realized that the horn harness is separate from the headlight harness, which is separate from the engine harness. So I'm going to first remove the horn harness. So there's one plug on the back of each horn, and it literally just needs to be unplugged in order to take that out. And then this horn harness, which is just this piece right here, is now out. I'm not yet convinced that the headlight harness and the engine harness are separate. There is some wiring that goes through into the fender well on the driver's side, and it's grounding to the bracket where the voltage regulator bolts. So I'm going to go into the fender well area and see exactly what we need to do to get this wire out from the front of the car. All right, we're now inside the driver's side fender well, and this is the wiring harness that I was speaking about. And as you can see, it's bolted in there. We'll deal with that in a minute. I first want to get off this shield to expose what's underneath here. And there's just these three clips that I just need to pop out. All right, we're still working on trying to gain access to the back side of the headlights. And I'm going to remove what appears to be 4 3/8 bolts and then also 3 1/2-inch nuts. And that should remove or expose enough to be able to get to the back side of that headlight. All right, all the 1/2-inch nuts and bolts are out. Hindsight being 20/20, these two bottom nuts and bolts didn't need to come out. As you can see, this is a bracket, and I looked in the engine bay, and this goes all the way across to the other side of the car. But the two that were important were the nuts. This is actually the back side of the headlight assembly. So I'm now going to go to the front of the car to remove the headlight assembly from the front to see what it exposes to get this wiring out. All right, from the front of the car, there's 4 screws that hold this headlight bezel in, so we're going to go ahead and pull that off now. All right, I'm to the point where I can either take out just both of the headlights or I can take out the full headlight assembly. I think taking out the assembly will work, but I'm going to actually work step by step, and I'm going to take both of the headlights out, and it appears that they're being held in with 2 Phillips screws, and then there's 1 spring that's holding the headlight to the actual housing. The headlights are now out. Both of them are completely unplugged, but in order to get the wiring out, we will have to remove the front part or the assembly, and it looks like it's being held on here with a 1/2-inch bolt, and I'm going to have a nut on the back side, so I'm going to have to get an open end on that. Okay, and it looks like there's going to be 2 more 1/2-inch bolts on the back side of this grill, so we're going to go ahead and remove those, and then this should come out. All right, this car is humbling me once again. I did take those 2 nuts off and made the assumption that the headlight housing would be able to come out. Little did I know that the headlight housing on the driver's side is connected to the grill, which is then connected to, I'm going to assume, the passenger side housing. So I am now done on the driver's side, and I'm now going to move over to the passenger side to start removing all of that so I could then get the grill and headlight assembly / housing off so I could see what I could do to get the wiring harness out. All right, coming to the passenger side engine bay, as you can see, the harness, just like on the driver's side, goes through into the fender well. So we're now going to go to the passenger side fender well and see exactly what we need to expose in order to gain access to the headlight assembly as well as the wiring harness. All right, we're now in the passenger side fender well, and just behind where the headlights are is this big round thing. What is this? This is the vacuum canister. So to pull this out, we're going to have 2 1/2-inch bolts as well as 1 1/2-inch nut. So let's go ahead and pull this off. And then you'll also notice that there's going to be 2 vacuum lines up here, and I'll pull those off once we have more access to the vacuum canister. With the vacuum canister now out of the way, it exposes what would be 2 nuts that need to be removed. As you can see, one is missing here. So we're just going to remove this top one using a 1/2-inch socket. All right, we're going to do the same thing here on the passenger side as we did on the driver's side. We're going to remove the 4 screws to remove that headlight bezel. I did notice that one is missing, so we're going to remove the 3 Phillips screws. Next, we're going to pull off the headlights, which they're both being held on with 2 Phillips screws and 1 spring, so we're going to take both of those out now. All right, we're now ready to take out the grill. There's going to be a total of 3 1/2-inch bolts, 1 here on the outside and then 2 more on the engine bay. And this one on the outside will take both a 1/2-inch socket as well as an open-end wrench on the other side. Great, with those nuts and bolts now removed, we only have 1 more nut and bolt to remove this grill. And that's going to use both a 1/2-inch socket and a 1/2-inch open-end wrench. All the hardware is removed and the grill is now ready to come out. And there's going to be about, I think, 8 studs total. 2 back here, 2 here on the grill, 2 here on the grill, and 2 back here. So we just got to kind of wiggle its way off of the car. Great, with the grill out of the way, I can now see that there's going to be a rubber grommet on both the driver's side and passenger side that need to be removed. So let's go ahead and do that now. And now the same thing on the passenger side. All right, with the grommet now out of the way, I can see that the hole is smaller than the plug that goes into the back of the headlight. So it's obvious that the wiring is going to have to come out through the front. So I'm going to trace this through the fender well back into the engine bay and see what needs to come undone to get this out of the car. All right, we're now back under the driver's side fender well, and you're going to see that there's 2 wires here. The smaller one is for the fog light, and we'll deal with that later. So we're just going to focus on this larger one now that goes into the engine bay, and we're going to see what's necessary to get this out of the car. Okay, there's 2 holes in the fender well here, and the one behind the voltage regulator, closest to the front of the car, is where that wiring harness comes through the fender well. And it plugs in right here, and it also has a ground here. And I'm going to remove the ground using a 3/8 socket, and then we'll just unplug this, and this should fish through the fender well and fish back out through the front of the car. All right, we're now back under the driver's side fender well where we're just going to pull this right through, and we should be able to fish this out through the front. All right, we're now moving over to the passenger side where we're going to do the same work. It's going to be a little bit easier as we don't have the voltage regulator in our way. So we're just going to unplug the harness and remove that ground bolt. All right, we're now underneath the passenger side fender well area. You can see that we successfully got the wires fished through from inside the engine bay. And we now need to remove this wire loom clamp, which we're going to use a 3/8 socket to remove that screw. All right, we're now ready to work on the parking light wiring, which is going to be considerably easier than the headlight wiring. Why is that? The parking light wiring attaches to the back of the housing for the parking light. So that's all one piece. So we don't need to disconnect it like we did for the headlights. All we literally need to do is unplug that, fish that back through the fender well, and let that hang from underneath the car. We will remove that at a later time. And now the same thing on the passenger side. We're now on the front driver's side of the engine bay where we're now going to remove all of this wiring. We're first going to start by removing this rubber grommet that goes through the bracket that the voltage regulator bolts to. We are then going to remove the 2 3/8 screws that hold on these 2 wire loom clamps. We will disconnect this ground wire, also held on with a 3/8 screw. We will disconnect the wiring going to the voltage regulator, and we will remove the mount for the radio receiver suppression choke, also being held on with a 3/8 screw. Last, we will remove these 2 wire loom clamps that will then pull out and allow the wiring to lay down easily. All right, with all of this wiring now out of the way, we're now going to remove this wire loom clamp. It's being held on with 2 3/8 screws. All right, next we have another wire assembly clamp here, and it looks like it's being held on with 3 5/16 bolts. So let's get that out now. With the wire assembly clamp now removed, the wiring is easily able to be moved back. And now I'm going to unplug this from the wiring harness. I'm going to push that wire through the support bracket for the battery tray. I'm then going to remove this wire loom clamp using a 3/8 socket to get that screw. And then I'm going to remove this wire assembly clamp, also being held on with 2 3/8 screws. All right, next we're going to pull this out of the support bracket for the battery tray. We're going to unbolt this wire loom clamp using a 3/8 socket, and we're going to remove this ground using a 1/2" socket. All right, next we're going to remove the reservoir bag for the windshield wiper fluid, and that's going to expose what else is behind here that needs to be removed for the wiring. Okay, with the bag out of the way, we have a good understanding of what's left. So we're going to first take off the bracket that holds the reservoir bag using a 5/16 socket for both bolts. And that does need to come out of the way because it's blocking one of these wire loom clamps. And we're going to remove a series of 6 wire loom clamps. So 1, 2, 3, 4, underneath the solenoid, 5, and then 6 is the wire clamp assembly. After we do that, we're going to use a 1/2" open-end wrench to remove the positive battery cable, and then also come over here and remove the cable that goes from the solenoid down to the starter. We're now able to disconnect the wires that are connected to the starter relay. So starting on this side, which is the positive battery terminal, we're going to disconnect the black and yellow wire, which I believe goes to the alternator. This next wire goes down to a junction block just behind and below the starter relay. We have the red and blue wire connected to the S terminal, which goes to the ignition switch. We have the brown wire connected to the I terminal, which goes to the coil. And then there's one last wire here connected to the starter terminal of the relay. I don't exactly know where this goes to, whether it goes to a light, whether it goes to the ignition switch. I will add an update in a text overlay once I find that out. But now with all of that disconnected, we can go to the next step. And next, we're going to remove the final 3 things that are holding the wiring harness onto the passenger side. First is this ground wire. Second is this terminal on the junction block. And third is this wire loom clamp, all being held on with a 3/8 socket. So let's go ahead and remove that and get it out of the way. Now that all of the wiring on the passenger side is all the way back to the firewall, we're coming back over to the driver's side and we're going to do the same thing to try and get it all the way back to the firewall or through into the fender well here. Now you'll see that this wire right here is being held on with 2 wire loom clamps that are being held on with a 3/8 screw. So we'll go ahead and pull that out. Then we have our relay box right here, also being held on with 2 3/8 screws. So we're gonna take that off. Then we're gonna unplug all of the relays that are plugged in here. And that's going to be, it looks like a total of about 5. And we're gonna unplug those, and we're also going to mark the wires so that everything plugs back in correctly. All right, last, here's a ground wire, and it's being held on with a 5/16. The last thing we need to do over here is to unplug the stop lamp relay, which is plugged in right here. Then this part of the wiring harness is being held on with just a clamp, so we'll just pull that out. And then after that, that will allow us to start feeding the wires out through the fender well. All right, we're now gonna move away from the driver's side and come back over here to the passenger side, specifically where the wiring harness travels underneath the heater core and evaporator core box against the firewall, and then comes down just underneath where the steering column comes out of the firewall. So we're gonna get underneath this heater box to see exactly what's necessary to remove the wiring harness from underneath that area. We're now underneath the car, and I'm underneath the heater core and evaporator core box, and we're on the passenger side of the transmission tunnel. And you'll see that there is a wire assembly clamp here that's being held on with 2 3/8 bolts. So we're gonna pull that off now. All right, with that wire assembly clamp now removed, you can see that it has exposed another bracket where the wires go through rubber grommets and then go through the firewall on the passenger side. We're gonna come back to this later. For now, we're gonna continue removing the wire assembly clamps. We're going to work on the one that's just above the transmission tunnel. And this one just above the transmission tunnel is being held on with 3 3/8 bolts, so let's pull those out. All right, we can now remove the third and final wire assembly clamp, which is on the driver's side of the transmission tunnel, and it's being held on with 3 3/8 bolts. All right, with the wire assembly clamps now out of the way, I now see that there's a wire loom clamp that needs to come out. There's one that's accessible from under the car and another one up top that's accessible from under the hood. It's not clear if this one is bolted in or if this is just the push style that needs to be pulled out. It looks like there's some black paint covering it, so I'm gonna try and see what it's gonna take to get this one out. And now it's very hard to see, but there's one right here, and I'm gonna use a screwdriver to pry that out. We're now to a point where we can start unplugging the wires on the driver's side. And so you'll see that these 2 parts of the wiring harness go through into the fender well area. And it looks like that one wire that was going above the transmission tunnel plugs into the firewall. But let's first unplug these ones that go into the fender well so it gives us more access to see what is necessary to unplug the rest of it. All right, we're under the fender well now. We're gonna remove this wire loom clamp using a 3/8 socket. So we're now ready to disconnect the connections. There's 3 on this part of the wiring harness and then 2 here. First one being here, second one being right here. All right, now we can move these wires out of the way, and it appears that one of the wires on this one goes into the wiring harness that we are going to unplug from the firewall. But I think I can disconnect it here. Great. That part of the harness is now out, and I can remove this part as well. And that is now fully out. So all that is left is this one plug under the firewall, which I believe I should be able to just pull right out. With everything now done on the driver's side, we're moving over to the passenger side firewall. And what we're going to do is take off this bracket, which is being held on with 2 3/8 bolts, and I believe it's going to expose the plugs so we can unplug the rest of this wiring harness and pull it out of the engine bay. So let's get started on this final part now. Okay, we now have the bracket off and we've exposed the wires, but as you can see, I can't access the plug through this hole. So I'm now going to go under the dash on the passenger side to see what's necessary to expose the plugs and see if we can unplug those. All right, we're now going to go over to the passenger side floorboard and see exactly what we need to remove to expose the wiring. And from underneath the glove box, you're going to notice that there's this plate here and it's being held on with 2 Phillips screws. So we're going to pull that out now and see what's exposed underneath. All right, with that now out of the way, I am pretty confident that these are the 2 plugs that need to be unplugged. However, I want to have a little bit more room to gain access to these. So I believe I'm going to need to remove this plastic piece. And before doing so, I'm going to remove this bracket here, which is just being held on with a Phillips headed screw. And then we'll go ahead and see what's necessary to pull this down. All right, with that bracket now removed, it exposes 2 3/8 bolts on the left and 2 3/8 bolts on the right outside of camera view, and that's going to allow me to remove this plastic piece to gain more access to these plugs. All right, with that plastic piece now out of the way, you can actually see that hole into the firewall. You can see that these are the 2 plugs that need to be unplugged, and this will be the final step to remove the engine wiring harness out of the car. All right, now pull this out. 1 and 2. Oh, apparently, and 3. Let's go back into the passenger side cab of the car and unplug that 3rd part of the wiring harness. And this is the 3rd plug that needs to be removed. Let's just hope there's not a 4th. Okay, there's not. Great, we're done. And that is now everything. We're going to pull everything out of the car, and we're going to have a new wiring harness built for the car. While the main purpose of this video is removing the engine wiring harness, which is now completed, there are a series of 3 other electrical components in the engine bay that I want to remove now. And what you see now are a series of 6 relays, 5 that are by themselves here, 1 that is over here, and we're going to remove those now. The one that is by itself is being attached with 2 3/8 bolts, and the 5 relays that are together are being held together with what appears to be 6 5/16 bolts or screws. So let's go ahead and take those out now. And now over to the passenger side to remove both the starter solenoid as well as the junction block just underneath it. And both are being held on with 2 3/8 bolts. Great, we've now successfully pulled the engine wiring harness and all the electrical components out from the engine bay. And next up is I'm going to be sending the wiring harness out to get a brand new one built for the car. I'm also going to get a reproduction voltage regulator as well as a reproduction starter solenoid. And I'm also sending out all 6 relays that you saw me pull. Those are also going to be rebuilt. So stay tuned for more content on the restoration of my 1966 Lincoln Continental. Thanks, guys.